Hello, everyone. Before we get started, make sure to like and subscribe and leave a comment saying where you're from and when you watched. That way, YouTube will continue to show you stories like this. Now, let's get started. Asterisk, the old school is located at the end of a small street, where at night there is only the sound of the wind whistling through the old trees, and the sound of the wooden door creaking in silence. People around there often tell each other that there is a strange guard who still appears every night, patrolling the schoolyard, but what makes anyone who has seen him shiver is that he has no shadow. Whether it is the yellow streetlights or the bright moonlight, that tall, thin figure still floats like a ghost. My name is David, a student who has been attached to this school for 3 years. The first day I heard my friends whispering about the shadowless guard, I thought it was just one of the horror stories that kids often make up to scare each other. But then I, on a late night cleaning duty, witnessed that image for the first time. He wore a long silver-grey coat. His eyes were as deep as a dark pit. His slow but silent gait made the space suffocating. I held my breath and watched from the classroom window. My heart pounded as I realized that under the fluorescent lights in the yard, everything had a shadow. The trees, the benches, even the deformed trash can. Only him, the ground beneath his feet was empty, as if he did not belong to this world. After that night, I no longer dared to stay at school after dark, but the haunting did not stop. Many other students also said that they heard footsteps lingering in the hallway when the school was quiet. But when they turned around, they saw no one. Rumors said that he was not an ordinary employee, but a trapped soul, tied to the school because of a dark past that had never been revealed. One time, a group of 4 curious people decided to stay to find the truth. We sneaked into the library at dusk, carrying flashlights and phones to record anything. Everything was quiet at first, but as midnight approached, a clanking sound came from the end of the hallway. The flashlight wavered, and there he was, still tall and thin, still wearing the strange silver coat. But this time, his eyes looked straight at us, as if he knew we were watching. The group trembled, but instead of running away, a brave friend called out, "Who are you?" The voice echoed in the large space, but the guard remained silent. He slowly raised his hand, pointing towards the old classroom that had been locked for a long time. When our eyes followed that gesture, a loud bang suddenly rang out. The old door swung open. Even though everyone knew it had been sealed before, we panicked and ran to the gate. But when we looked back, he had disappeared, leaving only the wide open door and the deep darkness inside. That night, no one could sleep. The only question that kept repeating in my head, who is he and why did he bind me to this place? People around whispered that before the current guard was installed, the school had a horrific incident that haunted the whole neighborhood for many years, but no one dared to tell the details. The story about him just spread from one rumor to another, each time becoming more terrifying, and I knew, to find the truth, I had to go back to the old classroom that he had pointed out, because only there the horrific past would gradually appear, and I would face the mystery that the whole town had avoided for decades. But that was also when things became more terrifying than I thought, when darkness began to creep into my daily life, turning it into a nightmare with no way out. My story had only just begun, and what I found behind that old door would keep you awake. I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease from that night on. Every time I passed the school, the image of the shadowless guard appeared in my mind like an ink stain in water. My friends, who had witnessed the same night, all chose to forget, but I didn't. I was driven by obsession, a terrible curiosity about what was behind the old door he had pointed to. I decided to go back, even though I knew I might be walking into a story with no way out. That night, I brought a flashlight and a phone, snaking into the school alone through the side gate. The wind blew through the trees. The dry leaves rustled like ghostly whispers. The darkness swallowed every step, and the echo of my own voice made me shiver. I walked slowly down the quiet hallway, each glass window reflecting my pale face under the silver moonlight. The old door appeared before my eyes, mottled with rust, peeling paint like a witness to time. I put my hand on the doorknob, my heart pounding violently. The strange thing was that it was not locked, just a gentle push, and the door creaked open, revealing a dark space. A musty stench like from a tomb rose up, making me choke. Inside was a row of abandoned classrooms. Dust covered the tables and chairs, cobwebs hung like a black curtain. I swung the flashlight. The shaky light illuminated the strange lines of writing carved on the wall. Not the drawings of mischievous students, but squiggly lines of characters, repeating like a curse. I leaned closer, reading a shaky line. He never left. A chill ran down my spine. I stepped back, but suddenly heard footsteps coming from the end of the hallway. I turned off the flashlight, my heart pounding, holding my breath to observe. In the dim darkness, a familiar figure appeared. It was him, the shadowless guard. He was only a few meters away from me, but the terrifying thing was at this time, he did not just stand still. He walked towards me, each step heavy but silent, not making any sound other than the sound of air whistling through his teeth. I turned to run, but the hallway seemed endless. Tables and chairs were knocked over. Blocking the way, windows were sealed tightly. The footsteps behind me still followed me, as if the distance was getting closer. I desperately pushed a door, and luckily it opened. I rushed inside, locked it, and sat down on the cold tile floor. The moonlight shone through the opaque window, illuminating the room full of old files. I searched desperately and discovered a yellowed document. On the outside was written, "Accident Report, 1975. My heart stopped beating. I opened it, and each page revealed blurred lines of text describing a mysterious fire that had claimed the lives of many people. One name in particular was mentioned repeatedly: Thomas, the only security guard there. It was noted that after the incident, his body was never found. Suddenly, a loud knock sounded from outside the door, each beat heavy like a hammer. I trembled, hugging the document tightly. Outside, a hoarse voice spoke, whispering but echoing throughout the room. "You should not know this truth." I choked, cold sweat trickled down my spine. I knew I didn't have much time left, but curiosity was still greater than fear. I had to find out everything about the man named Thomas, the shadowless guard who had haunted this school for half a century. The knocking continued, getting louder and louder, as if the door was about to burst. I took a deep breath, stuffed the document into my backpack, and prepared to find a way to escape. And I knew that even deeper secrets were waiting for me in the darkness. But as I opened the window and was about to climb out, a cold hand grabbed my shoulder from behind. The cold hand on my shoulder made my whole body numb. I turned around in extreme fear, but there was no one behind me. The room was so quiet that all I could hear was my own rapid breathing. My heart was pounding like it was about to burst. I quickly climbed out the window, sliding down to the wet grass outside. When my feet touched the ground, I looked back, and at the window upstairs, the shadowless guard was silently watching me. His deep eyes seemed to want to swallow my soul. I hugged my backpack tightly. Inside was a document about the 1975 fire. All the way home, I always had the feeling that something was following me. Just turning around would catch his eyes. But when I reached safety, opened the file, each rotten page made the truth even more terrifying. The fire originated from the old school building. The file clearly stated that the fire broke out on a rainy night when a group of students were still trapped in the classroom. The only person present to save them was Thomas, the night guard. But the strange thing was that he completely disappeared after the tragedy. No one found his body, nor was there any evidence that he had escaped. People began to believe that Thomas's soul still lingered in the school, forever bound to the place that had become a grave for the unfortunate students. I read to the end, trembling as I realized a terrible detail. In the witness's testimony, a student said that before passing out in the smoke and fire, they saw Thomas's figure standing right at the classroom door, but did not rush in to save them. His eyes were cold and lifeless, as if he was watching a cruel game. I folded the document, my heart filled with questions. Was the shadowless man I met really Thomas? Or was he just a cursed image of someone who betrayed innocent children? That school was clearly not only haunted, but also chained by a curse. From that day on, I began to experience strange phenomena. The sound of footsteps in the middle of the night echoed right outside my door. Sometimes, a knocking sound on the window startled me awake. Every time I looked in the mirror, I vaguely saw behind me the silhouette of a man in a silver coat, his dark eyes never leaving. I knew clearly that I had awakened something. One night, as I lay in a fitful dream, I heard a whisper right next to my ear. "You won't escape from that place." I jumped up, sweating profusely, but the room was still empty. The file on the table was open, the pages turning without wind, as if by an invisible hand. The haunting grew stronger, forcing me to find an answer. I decided to go back to the school again, this time not only to learn about Thomas, but also to face the cursed room. I wanted to know if the souls of the unfortunate students were really still trapped there in the darkness of the abandoned school. Every step seemed to lead me deeper into another world, and I understood that, from this moment, I had stepped into one of the most terrifying haunted stories I had ever experienced in my life. But all that I was about to witness was just the beginning of the real nightmare. That night, I decided to return to the school once more. My instinct told me that the truth lay not in the old records, but in the very place where the abandoned classrooms had been engulfed in fire in 1975. I brought a flashlight, a lighter, and a small knife as a talisman, even though I knew they would be useless against an invisible force. The wind began to pick up, the branches of the trees hitting the glass doors, making a cracking sound that made my blood run cold. I stepped into the school grounds, where the darkness was as thick as a blanket. Each step on the old tiles made a dry sound. I entered the familiar hallway, where I had last seen the shadowless guard. The space was thick, the cold seeping through my skin. As the flashlight swept across, the mottled walls seemed to breathe, the darkness swirling around like a living creature. I arrived in front of the door of the classroom where the fire had occurred. Inside, the smell of old smoke still lingered, mixed with a suffocating, musty smell. The scorch marks on the tables and chairs were like wounds that would never heal. I used the flashlight to shine on every corner, and suddenly saw a faint trace of chalk on the blackboard. We were never freed. A shiver ran down my spine. I felt eyes watching me from everywhere. Suddenly, a childish laughter rang out clearly in the middle of the room. The sound echoed, lingering, not belonging to this world. I turned around, but there was no one. When I pointed the flashlight at the end of the classroom, a figure appeared, standing right next to the broken window. I held my breath and looked closely. It was a boy wearing an old school uniform, his face blackened by smoke, his eyes empty. I stepped back, my heart pounding. The boy opened his mouth, but his voice was hoarse like an adult's. Why didn't he save us? I knew the boy was talking about Thomas, the shadowless guard. Before I could answer, the image vanished like smoke, leaving a dead silence. Footsteps echoed in the hallway again, slow and heavy. I knew who was coming. The shadowless guard appeared in the doorway, his deep eyes looking straight at me. Despite the bright flashlight, the space under his feet was lifeless, without a shadow. He moved closer, and I heard the wind whistling through the hallway like the sighs of dozens of trapped souls. I retreated to the back of the classroom, accidentally tripping over a broken desk. When I looked up, he had disappeared, but instead, new words appeared on the wall, as if carved by an invisible hand. You cannot escape. The room suddenly shook. The windows slammed shut, and dust filled the air. The screams of children echoed from all sides, mixed with the sound of the fire. I felt like I was being pulled back to that fateful night in 1975, when the fire engulfed the entire row of rooms and the desperate cries for help echoed. I screamed, running towards the main door, but it was locked. In that suffocating moment, I realized one thing. This was not just a memory, but a repeating truth, a ghostly loop that imprisoned everything. And perhaps, now, I had also become a part of that story. But what scared me the most was the hoarse call that rang out right behind me. It's your turn. After the night I was trapped in the scorched room, I returned home in a state of panic. It seemed like everything was over, but the truth was just beginning. From that day on, my home was no longer a safe place. I began to notice unusual things appearing in every corner. When I looked in the bathroom mirror, sometimes I saw the shadow of a man in a silver coat behind me. But when I turned around, the room was completely empty. There were nights when I heard footsteps repeating in the hallway of my house, slow, heavy, exactly like footsteps in school. I began to suspect that the curse was not only confined to the school campus, but it followed me home. Every time I passed by the mirror, even for a split second, I would still see that shadow. The shadow was not real, but appeared clearly in the glass, making me shiver. One time, when I stood in the living room, the mirror on the wall reflected a completely different scene. Instead of my house, it showed the gloomy corridor of the old school, and right in the middle of that corridor, the shadowless guard stood silently, staring straight at me. These creepy phenomena became more and more frequent. My phone rang with calls without a displayed number. When I picked up, all I heard was hoarse breathing and a whisper. You cannot escape. At night, my window shook slightly, as if someone was tapping from outside. But when I looked down, the street was empty. Not a soul in sight. I tried to tell my friends everything, but no one believed me. They thought I was too obsessed. Only one close friend, Michael, dared to listen. He advised me to go to the city library, where many old documents related to the school were kept. We made an appointment to go there on the weekend, hoping to find more clues about the fire and the shadowless guard. But before I could carry out my plan, something happened that scared me more than anything else I had ever experienced. That night, while I was half awake, I heard a childish laugh echoing in my room. I jumped up, looked around, but there was no one. The lights in the room suddenly went out, leaving only the dim light from the phone screen. I reached for it, but what appeared on the screen was not the familiar interface, but an image of a burned-out classroom. In the middle of the classroom, the guard stood still, his empty eyes fixed on me. The phone fell to the floor. I took a shaky step back, and then the bedroom mirror shook violently. On the opaque surface, I saw that I was no longer standing alone. Beside me were the burned, disfigured faces of the children who had died in the fire in 1975. They whispered, "Why did he abandon us?" I collapsed, my whole body paralyzed. At that moment, the image in the mirror changed. The shadowless guard slowly stepped closer, his deep eyes filling the glass. He raised his hand, pressing his cold hand against the mirror. I stepped back, but it felt like the glass had disappeared. The distance between us was only a few steps. The lights in the room turned back on. Everything was gone. But I knew clearly this was no longer an illusion. He was invading my life, pulling me step by step deeper into the darkness. And the trip to the library with Michael might be my only chance to know the truth, or it might be the door to a new horror. The next morning, I met Michael to go to the city library. I looked so haggard that he had to ask me a lot of questions, but I just told him briefly that the shadowless guard had followed me home. Michael did not laugh. His eyes were more serious than ever. We brought cameras, notepads, and were determined to find any documents related to the 1975 fire. The city library was large. The ancient wooden bookshelves gave off a musty smell of old paper. We asked permission to enter the special archives, where records from decades ago were kept. The old librarian looked at us with an unreadable look, then nodded slightly, pointing to a small room at the end of the hallway. The room was dark, only the sound of the ceiling fan creaking. Boxes of files were stacked, covered with thick dust. Michael and I searched for hours until we came across a file labeled Northwood School -1975. My hands shook as I opened it, and the first thing I saw was a black and white photograph of a burned-out classroom. In the photo, amid the smoke, a tall, thin figure stood, but strangely, there was no shadow at his feet. Michael looked at me, both of us silent. Turning to the next page, the reports described the fire in detail. Many students died. The fire broke out in the lab. There was a handwritten note. Thomas was seen standing outside the classroom door, but he did not help anyone. Below, in shaky handwriting, it added, he disappeared after the incident. But many witnesses said they had seen him walking around the schoolyard for many years. What made me shiver was that some pages of the file had been torn out, especially the part about the investigation into the cause of the fire. Only a short piece of paper with the words written in crimson, "Stop looking," while I was still lost in thought. Michael suddenly pointed to the end of the file. There was a list of the dead students, with their ages and names. I read each name, my heart suddenly tightening as I realized something strange. On the list was the name of a boy who matched the silhouette I had seen in the scorched classroom. His name was Daniel, 12 years old. A shiver ran through my body. What I had witnessed was not an illusion, but the souls of children who had never been freed. I told Michael. He was silent, then said softly, "We must find out the real reason. If Thomas betrayed them, perhaps your soul is forever damned." At that moment, the lights in the archive room flickered continuously. The ceiling fan slowed down and then stopped. The space was filled with heavy silence. In the dusty window glass, I saw the shadowless image of the guard standing right behind us. I turned around, but the room was empty. Michael turned pale, his voice trembling. "Did you see?" I nodded, my hand still holding the file tightly. I knew clearly that from here on, we had no way back. This story was no longer just a rumor, but one of the true scary stories that existed in real life, haunting everyone who dared to enter. And the most terrifying thing was that the file we brought back not only contained the truth about Thomas, but also hid clues related to a much larger dark force. Michael and I carried the file out of the library, but the moment the door closed, a cold wind blew through, making me feel as if the pages didn't want to leave the place where they had been forgotten. On the way back, Michael was silent the whole time, his eyes fixed on the empty space behind us, where it seemed like someone was following us. I knew that feeling wasn't an illusion, because every hair on the back of my neck stood up. When I got home, I opened the file again, reading each line carefully. Among the blurred pages, I discovered a strange note. "Whoever touches the file will wake him." I shuddered, realizing the truth that since opening the file in the library, I had voluntarily walked into a trap. The shadows appearing in the mirror, the whispers in the night, were no longer just around me, but now also spread to Michael. That night, we decided to sleep together to avoid the feeling of loneliness. But when the clock struck midnight, the house was plunged into a terrifying silence. The howling wind outside the window mixed with the creaking sound of old wood to create a gloomy melody. I had just dozed off when I heard a rustling sound in the living room. Michael immediately jumped up, grabbing the iron rod. We slowly walked out, the flashlight beams scanning the space. The scene before our eyes made both of us speechless. On the living room wall, each line of words appeared as if carved by an invisible hand. "You cannot leave." Each word's smoke rose, slowly dissipating in the air. Michael trembled, his mouth muttering, "We have already pulled him out of the school." At that moment, the mirror hanging on the wall of my house shook violently. The reflection was no longer the living room, but the abandoned school corridor, the cold moonlight shining through the broken window. And there, the shadowless guard stood motionless, but his face gradually lifted, his deep black eyes staring straight at us. I backed away, bumping into a chair, and Michael froze like a statue. The sound of children crying echoed from the mirror, each scorched face gradually appearing. We were surrounded by sobbing sounds, mournful whispers, "Don't leave us alone." I couldn't bear it anymore, so I took a stick and hit the mirror hard. Shards of glass flew everywhere, falling to the floor. But the scary thing was that in each shard of glass, the image of the guard was still there. His eyes multiplied dozens of times, staring. We ran out of the living room, our hearts pounding like they were about to burst out of our chests. Michael shouted, "He's out. This is no longer a safe place." I understood clearly. The curse of the school had followed us back, turning the house into a part of the haunted land. That night, I realized we had no way out. Northwood School was not only haunted, but anyone who dared to rekindle memories would become part of the curse. And now, we were in that vortex. But it was only just beginning, because in the darkness, I heard a familiar, deep laugh behind me. "Your house is now mine." Since the night of the broken mirror, my sleep has become a torture. Every time I close my eyes, I am drawn into a nightmare that recreates the scene of the fire that engulfed the classroom building in 1975. The screams, the sound of collapsing tables and chairs, and the stench of smoke filled my lungs. making me cough even in my dreams. I found myself trapped among the students, and right at the door of the classroom, Thomas, the shadowless guard, was still there. His eyes followed each soul that burned without moving. Michael was no better. He recounted that in his dreams, he often heard footsteps lingering right next to his ear, and when he turned around, he was always there, silent, motionless, but omnipresent. We gradually realized that the nightmare was not just happening in our minds, but part of the curse that was slowly consuming us both. One evening, while I was trying to sleep, I suddenly heard sobbing right next to my bed. I jumped up, turned on the flashlight, and saw a boy huddled in the corner of the room. His face was burned, his eyes were lifeless, but tears were still flowing. I asked in a choked voice, "Are you Daniel?" The boy just nodded slightly, then his chapped lips whispered, "He won't let us leave." Immediately after, his image disappeared in a puff of smoke, leaving the room cold. We began to find a way to fight back. Michael suggested going back to the school again, bringing the file and putting it back in its rightful place, hoping that this would sever the link. But deep down, I knew it was too late. The shadowless guard was not only bound by the pages, but we, the ones who revived the secret, had become the new link in the curse. The obsession reached its peak when one morning, I woke up and found a scorch mark on my arm as if burned by fire. Michael also confessed that he had strange bruises, imprinted like someone's hand squeezing tightly. We knew that the darkness was creeping into reality, making us living witnesses to one of the most terrifying true horror stories. I began to write down every event, every sound, every wound, every recurring dream. Maybe someone out there would need the evidence if we didn't survive. But as I was writing, I heard the familiar 3-beat knock on the door. I raised my head, and in the narrow crack, a tall, thin figure appeared. I didn't need to look closely to know who it was. The shadowless guard was standing right outside, waiting. Ever since the shadowless guard appeared outside our door, Michael and I had barely slept. We decided to return to Northwood High School to confront it. But before that, the creepy phenomena continued to haunt us, as if it wanted to wear down our will before devouring us. One night, as we sat in the living room, I suddenly heard a creaking sound coming from the ceiling. Michael looked up, his face pale. I swung the flashlight up, and immediately my trembling hand made the light waver. Dozens of figures hung from the ceiling, their bodies scorched, their eyes wide open, staring down at us. Whispers echoed, forming disjointed sentences. We were abandoned. We were never freed. Michael rushed to the wall, trying to turn on the main light, but the whole house was plunged into darkness. The figure on the ceiling did not disappear. On the contrary, it became clearer in the dim light of the moon outside the window. I recognized Daniel, the boy who had appeared in the mirror. His eyes were fixed on me, as if pleading, as if resentful. I trembled and shouted, "What do you want me to do?" The air was thick, cold, and suffocating. One of the figures spoke hoarsely, "Return him to where he belongs." Before I could understand, all the figures disappeared at the same time, leaving a terrifying silence. Michael sat down on the floor, his face pale. He said, "I think we have become part of those creepy stories that we have only heard from others. But this time, we are the main characters." I knew he was right. What we witnessed was no longer just a rumor, but the obvious truth. We discussed it, decided to bring the file back to school. Perhaps opening it had caused the curse to spread, and the only way was to return it to its original place. But deep in my heart, I knew it would not be that easy. The shadowless guards seemed to want us to continue, to push us deeper into the darkness so that we could never return. That night, when I was preparing to go back to school early in the morning, I heard 3 knocks on the bedroom door again. But this time, instead of appearing outside the door, the tall, thin figure was right in the room, standing silently in the corner. His eyes were shining brightly in the darkness, fixed on me, and a faint smile appeared. The whole room became cold. His breath froze into wisps of smoke. Michael pulled my hand hard, pulling me out, but before the door slammed shut, I saw the figure take a long step, as if wanting to follow us to the end. The next morning, as the sun was rising, Michael and I carried the old file back to Northwood School. The early morning air was chilly, but the school exuded an unusually heavy silence. The broken glass windows reflected the weak light. Each warped wooden door seemed to be groaning. We stood in front of the school gate, both of us silent for a long time. Michael clenched the file in his hand, softly saying, "If we return it, maybe the curse will end." I nodded, but in my heart I did not believe that things could be that easy. Passing through the gate, the rusty hinges sounded like a scream. We walked slowly down the hallway. The wind blew through the broken windows, creating a long, eerie whistling sound. The familiar, musty smell filled the place, bringing us back to the haunting night. I realized that every corner of the wall, every charred table and chair bore traces of a tragic past. We stopped in front of the burned classroom door, where I first saw Daniel. Michael tremblingly opened his backpack and placed a file on the scorched teacher's desk. When the file hit the desk, the atmosphere suddenly changed. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly. The cold air blew out, making us shiver. The pages flipped continuously, even though there was no wind. As if someone was reading each line, suddenly, children's voices rang out throughout the classroom. Laughter, crying, and cries for help mixed together into a chaotic sound. The silhouettes of children appeared little by little around the room, their lifeless eyes looking at us. Daniel appeared again, standing right next to the blackboard. He said softly, "He won't let us go." At that moment, familiar footsteps echoed in the hallway. We all knew who was coming. The door swung open, and the shadowless guard appeared, tall and thin, his silver coat fluttering in the cold wind. Beneath his feet, the lifeless void was still visible, without a shadow. His eyes stared at us, expressionless, but filled with deep gloom. Michael stepped back, his mouth trembling. "We've returned it. Please let us go." But the guard didn't move. Instead, from behind him, a series of scorched hands reached out from nowhere, gripping the classroom doorframe as if to block our escape. The air became thick, making me suffocate. I mustered up all my courage to shout, "What do you want us to do?" Daniel pointed his hand straight at the guard, his eyes filled with indignation. "He's the one who kept us here." The shadows screamed in unison, the sound reverberating throughout the classroom. The shadowless guard remained still, but his face gradually distorted, showing rough black burn marks. We understood that returning the files was just the beginning. To free those souls, we had to face the Guardian directly, and he, with his dark eyes, seemed to have been waiting for this moment for a long time. The shadowless guard stood tall in the doorway, his deep eyes fixed on Michael and me. The souls of children surrounded me, their eyes burning with resentment. I felt like I was no longer an observer, but had been pulled into another world, where the usual rules no longer existed. The air in the abandoned classroom was thick. Every breath was heavy as lead. Michael grabbed my arm, whispering, "We have to do something. Otherwise he won't let go." I trembled and looked around, the scorched hands still gripping the doorframe, not allowing us to retreat. The only way was to face it. I took a step towards the guard, mustering up all my courage to speak. "Thomas, why are you keeping the children here? Don't you want them to be freed?" His face didn't change, but the atmosphere suddenly shook. The howling wind penetrated through the shattered windows. The sound of chairs and tables colliding loudly, as if an invisible hand had thrown them all over the place. The guard's dry, cracked lips moved slightly. A hoarse voice rang out, drawn out as if from the dead. I was not chosen. The fire itself made me a prisoner. I was speechless. That meant he was bound to, part of the curse that could not be broken. Daniel and the souls of the children screamed in unison, the sound tearing the air. He abandoned us. He must pay. The whole room shook, the ceiling cracked, dust fell. The guard covered his face with his hands, but his eyes still glowed darkly. Michael pulled me closer, shouting, "We are in the middle of one of those paranormal stories that humans should not interfere with. If we stay, we will disappear like them." I knew he was right, but my feet seemed nailed to the floor. The crying, the screaming, the wind, all combined into a terrifying music. Suddenly, I realized that the file on the table was shaking violently. The pages were opened, revealing the words in red ink. "Only the truth will set you free." I rushed forward, grabbed the file, and read the blurred words aloud. It clearly stated that the fire was not an accident. It originated from a hidden experiment, and Thomas was just a person forced to stay behind to cover up the truth. The souls were silent for a moment. The guard looked at me, his eyes flashing with pain, no longer as dark as before. But then, a shrill screech rang out from deep in the hallway, pulling everything back into chaos. Something else was lurking, not just Thomas or the children, but a more terrible dark force was lurking. The room exploded with noise, lights flashing wildly. Michael and I rushed to the door, but before we could escape, I heard Thomas's voice again. "You have opened the way. Prepare." We fell down the hallway, gasping for breath, knowing the nightmare wasn't over yet. And in the darkness behind us, unfamiliar footsteps sounded, not Thomas's, but something far more terrifying. The long hallway swallowed us up as strange footsteps echoed behind us. Michael and I ran desperately, our breaths echoing in the dense space. The door leading to the schoolyard appeared before our eyes, but suddenly the scene distorted. The brick walls were warped and mottled, the hallway cracked, the ceiling stretched endlessly like a living maze. The whole world around me twisted into a terrifying scene, as if someone was turning reality into a giant animated horror story, and we were the characters drawn to endure the fear. Michael held my hand tightly, his eyes wide with horror. From the end of the hallway, a giant black mass began to crawl towards us. It had no specific shape. Sometimes it was a distorted human face. Sometimes it was a scorched, monstrous body. Sometimes it melted into dozens of arms, reaching out from nothingness. With each step it took, the surrounding space twisted, the dim light flickering like an old movie. We rushed into another classroom, slammed the door, but the darkness continued to creep through the cracks in the walls and windows. It seemed not only present, but also consumed everything it touched. The tables and chairs disintegrated into dust. The glass doors shattered into pieces that floated in the air. I screamed in panic. This is no longer Thomas. This is what trapped him and the children. Michael trembled, but nodded. "We have to find a way to cut it off," he whispered. In the chaos, I saw the file fall out of my backpack, the pages turning rapidly. On it appeared cartoonish doodles, describing the fire, screaming souls, and the giant shadow that covered everything. I realized that what we were seeing was the truth redrawn by the darkness. It wanted to tell us that every event was just a pawn in its sick game. The flashlight in my hand flickered, then went out completely. In the complete darkness, I heard a hoarse laugh, not a child's, nor Thomas's. It echoed like hundreds of voices combined, forming a message. "You will stay here. Forever." I hugged the file, screaming in despair. Suddenly, in the darkness, Daniel appeared again. But this time he was different. His face was bright, his eyes filled with anticipation. Daniel pointed to an exit hidden in the dust. "Trust us. Only the truth can break." Then he disappeared. We ran in the direction Daniel pointed. The huge darkness hissing angrily, rushing after us like a black wave. Each step was heavy, as if being dragged into the mud, but we still ran, knowing this could be our only chance. After escaping the warped corridor, Michael and I thought we had found a way out. But when I opened my eyes, I realized I was standing in my own house, the familiar house now transformed into a cold maze. Everything was unusually quiet. Only the yellow light from the table lamp remained. Michael disappeared, leaving me completely alone. I walked step by step in the house, my heart pounding. Family photos hung on the walls, but everyone's faces were warped into dark gaps. I heard footsteps on the second floor, even though I knew I was home alone. The wooden stairs creaked, the footsteps getting closer. I held my breath, gripping the flashlight tightly, the shaky light illuminating the empty space at the end of the stairs. A tall, thin figure appeared, without a shadow under my feet. I stepped back, my legs trembling. He stood there, silent, his deep eyes staring at me. The air in the house was thick. My every breath echoed off the walls, as if being mimicked. Suddenly, a familiar 3-beat knock sounded from the window. I turned, and the reflection in the glass was dozens of scorched children's faces staring back. I shouted, "What do you want from me?" A whispering voice answered, echoing from all four sides. "Don't let him imprison anyone else." I understood that they wanted me to do something to break the cycle. But I was just a small human, powerless against a cursed entity for decades. The house shook violently. Darkness poured in from every crack, overwhelming the weak light. Tables and chairs collapsed, walls cracked. The shadowless guard approached, his long hand reaching out towards me. I felt paralyzed, as if nailed to the spot. In a moment of despair, I heard Michael's voice from afar. "Don't give up. Find the ultimate truth." I struggled, freed myself from the invisible hand that was squeezing me, and ran up to the second floor. The bedroom door was wide open, and a blinding light burst out from inside. On the table, the file appeared again. This time, the pages were glowing like fire. I rushed forward, grabbed it, and was immediately pulled into a vortex of light. Before I was completely submerged, I looked back. The shadowless guard stood at the bottom of the stairs, his eyes shining with pain, and behind him, a huge mass of darkness began to separate, stretching out its long arms towards me. The swirl of light transported me to another dimension, and when I opened my eyes, I found myself standing in the middle of Northwood High School in a heavy rainstorm. The rain poured down, each drop of cold hitting my skin, making me shiver. Everything around me was gloomy, The sky was dark, as if it was about to collapse. The sound of rain echoed everywhere, not only the sound of falling rain, but also the screams and cries for help of the children from years ago. I walked slowly on the slippery tile floor. Each puddle reflected faint faces and then disappeared as soon as I met eyes. Michael appeared in the distance, drenched, his eyes panicked. He shouted loudly, but his voice was drowned out by the rain, leaving only a choked echo. I ran towards him, but the distance seemed endless. Suddenly, a fire broke out in the middle of the rain, burning brightly in an absurd way. The red flames engulfed the classrooms. Black smoke swirled and mixed with the sound of pouring rain, creating a ghostly scene. In the midst of the fire, I saw the souls of children raising their hands for help, their mouths open, screaming. I rushed forward, but in vain, my steps heavy as if I were tied up. The shadowless guard appeared, standing motionless between the rain and the fire. Rain poured down on his body, but not a drop remained. He raised his head, his deep eyes looked up at the sky, then softly said hoarsely, "I cannot leave, nor can I save them. This fire is not human." I was shocked, understanding that there was another force behind it. A force that used the fire to imprison both him and the other souls. Michael shouted from afar, "We must find the real cause of the fire. Otherwise, everything will repeat itself forever." The sound of the rain grew louder, drowning out all sounds, leaving only the sound of my heart pounding. The fire still burned despite the rain, as if it was nourished by human souls and not ordinary fuel. As I got closer, a giant black shadow slowly emerged from behind the fire, stretching out its long arms as if to grab everything. The wind blew in the opposite direction. The rain splashed so hard that I almost fell down. The black shadow howled angrily. The sound mixed with the rain, creating a deathly song that made my whole body tremble. I realized the truth that the curse was not only attached to Thomas or the children, but also to the dark entity behind the fire. We were just the ones being pulled into the loop to continue feeding its power. The rain suddenly stopped, leaving a chilling silence. I opened my eyes and found myself and Michael sitting in the middle of a completely unfamiliar room. The four walls were covered with torn papers, written all over with words as if someone had been writing down the whole incident for years. I moved closer, my heart pounding as I realized the content on the papers was no different from what we had just experienced. Every detail, every name, every scene of burning was described exactly. Michael trembled and muttered, "Who wrote all this before it happened?" I couldn't answer. All I knew was that these pages were exactly like a creepypasta. Ghost stories passed around by word of mouth on the internet, but this was not fiction. This was a scenario that someone or something had written long ago, and we were just repeating it. I bent down to pick up a piece of paper that had fallen off the wall. On it was scrawled words. "When you read this, he will be standing right behind you." I froze, slowly turning around, and as I said, the shadowless guard appeared, silently looking at me. His eyes were as deep as a dark pit, his hand gently raised, pointing at the pile of papers on the wall. Each sheet of paper shook, fluttering around the room. The sound of children laughing and crying echoed in the narrow space. One sheet was stuck right in front of me. The words as red as blood appeared. "There is no end," I choked. A feeling of despair rising. Michael shouted loudly, tearing a sheet of paper, but immediately two more appeared to replace it. The room turned into a paper storm, each piece flying around, cutting into our flesh like a sharp knife. I held my head, trying to avoid it, while the shadow of the guard grew larger and larger, covering the entire space in the chaos. I noticed a corner of the wall with a narrow door. The door read, "The living may choose, but the price will be heavy." Michael and I rushed forward, despite the sharp pain of the paper cutting into our skin. The guard's cold hand reached out, almost touching my shoulder. I pushed the door open with all my might, and we both fell into the darkness. Before the door slammed shut, I heard a voice echo, "You are just the next words." The door slammed shut behind me, and darkness engulfed Michael and me. We landed on the hard ground, the smell of mold and rotting leaves filling my nose. When I looked up, I realized I was in the middle of a dense forest. The night was dark, the wind whistled through the tall trees. There was no trace of Northwood School, only the chirping of insects mixed with the deadly silence. Michael was bewildered. "Where are we?" I didn't know how to answer, just felt like this was also part of that scary cycle. We decided to set up a temporary camp to stay for the night. Under the dim moonlight, we gathered dry branches and started a small fire. The weak light illuminated Michael's face, revealing his fatigue and fear. I was no better, but in my despair, the light of the fire still brought a fragile safety. As I sat next to the fire, I heard footsteps rustling in the dry leaves. I turned around, but there was no one. Michael whispered, "It must be a wild animal," but my instincts told me otherwise. The darkness in the forest was so thick it seemed to have eyes, watching our every move. That night, while I was trying to sleep, I heard children's laughter coming from afar. The laughter mixed with the wind, echoing as if from another world. I jumped up. The fire was almost out. The trees around me cast twisted shadows. Michael was still sleeping, breathing heavily. I tiptoed out, my heart pounding. At the edge of the forest, I saw a group of silhouettes. Under the moonlight, they were children, their bodies burned, their clothes torn. They stood still, motionless, their eyes staring at me. I trembled and retreated, but they did not come closer. Instead, they raised their hands in unison, pointing in a direction deep in the forest. Before I could understand, suddenly from behind me, familiar footsteps rang out. The shadowless sentinel stood just a few meters away, the moonlight shining through but casting no shadow. His eyes followed the direction the children had pointed. Then he nodded slowly, as if telling me to go on. I panicked and went back to camp, shaking Michael awake. We discussed and decided to take the other path the next morning, even though we had no idea where it would lead. But I knew one thing for sure: it would bring us closer to the truth. The night in the forest seemed endless. I lay there, listening to the howling wind, the chirping of insects, and the occasional mournful laugh. This was no longer a normal camping trip, but a step deeper into a nightmare. Dawn broke. A faint light filtered through the leaves. Michael and I extinguished the fire, packed up, and followed the path the young spirits had pointed out the night before. The forest was unusually silent. No more birdsong or insects, only the cold whistling of the wind. We walked for hours until we suddenly saw a village appear in the middle of the forest, immersed in a thick fog. This village was deserted. All the houses were deserted, windows broken, wooden doors hanging loosely. The wells were dry, the roofs covered with moss. The air was thick with a suffocating musty smell. We entered an old house and immediately recognized the unusual atmosphere. The space was so thick, so cold that my skin was numb. Michael muttered, "This place? Haunted?" I nodded, my heart pounding inside the house. The tables and chairs were covered with thick dust, but there were new marks on the walls, as if someone had just scratched them. I shined my flashlight, and the long, jagged marks were clear, like the fingernails of a desperate person. Footsteps sounded from the upper floors. We held our breaths, and the wooden steps creaked as if they were crying. I walked slowly up the stairs, Michael following closely behind. When I reached the second-floor hallway, I saw the picture frames hanging in disarray. Each picture was half-burned, but the face of a man was still intact. It was Thomas. His shadow was in every picture, but there was no shadow underfoot. The whole village seemed to be part of the curse where he had appeared, imprinted on each abandoned house. Suddenly, the door at the end of the hallway opened. A cold wind rushed out, carrying with it a muffled whisper. Michael and I entered, and the sight left us stunned. The room was dark, but in the middle of the room was a wooden table, on which were piled old dolls. Each doll had a cracked face, hollow eyes, and the names of the children who had died in the fire in 1975 were engraved on their chests. I trembled and stepped back, but all the dolls turned to look at me. One spoke in a hoarse voice, "He will never let us go." Michael grabbed my hand and pulled me out, but the door slammed shut. All the dolls laughed in unison, the sharp sound echoing throughout the room. I screamed, pounding on the door with all my might. At that moment, the shadowless face of the guard appeared in the mirror on the wall, his deep eyes staring straight at us. His voice whispered, "This village is where the fire started. You have gone too far." The space swirled, the light disappeared, leaving us in the thick darkness. I knew that there would be more horror ahead, for we had entered the heart of the haunting. The dark doll room swirled and disappeared, and Michael and I fell to the cold ground. When we opened our eyes, we found ourselves in the middle of an abandoned village, but this time there was no fog. Everything was clear under the moonlight, and in front of us was a large wooden board, carved with words like an indictment. I approached, fear rising as I read each line. The content recorded the whole truth about the fire. It was not an accident, nor was it just a joke of fate. Northwood School was once the underground laboratory of an organization, using this very village to hide illegal research. The experiment failed. The fire created by the strange reactions engulfed the entire classroom and caused the children to die unjustly. Thomas, the guard, was assigned to watch over, but when everything collapsed, he was bound with the curse, becoming an unwilling custodian. Michael continued reading with a trembling voice. Those who touch the file will be drawn into the loop, to become immortal witnesses to the tragedy. My heart froze. What we were experiencing was not an illusion, but the true stories that had been hidden for decades. No one but us knew the truth, and no one would believe it if it were told. The wind in the village howled, blowing open the rotten wooden doors. Children's laughter rang out again, this time no longer sorrowful but full of defiance. Dolls fell out of the house, empty eyes turned towards us. I felt as if all the souls were watching our every move, waiting to see if we had the courage to reveal the truth. The shadowless guard appeared in the middle of the village. He stood still, his eyes dark, but for a moment I saw a pleading look, as if he wanted us to speak on his behalf the truth that had been hidden. Michael whispered, "He's not entirely an enemy. He's also a victim." At that moment, the ground shook violently. From the ground, a giant darkness rose again, roaring angrily. It wanted to swallow the entire village, to block us before the truth was revealed. The wind swirled, ash flew everywhere, the sky turned red. I held Michael's hand tightly. shouting into the wind, "We have to get out of here. Take this truth to where the light can shine." But I knew in my heart that the darkness would not let it be. The whole village shook violently. The rotten houses collapsed as if being crushed by an invisible force. Michael and I ran through the small alleys. The laughter and cries of children mixed together into an eerie song. The giant darkness rose from the ground, swirling like a storm, covering everything. In that chaotic sound, I clearly heard a deep, hoarse voice. "Blood has been spilled, souls have cried out. Now is the time for revenge." Michael shouted loudly in the whirlwind. "This is no longer just a curse. This is a revenge story that we have been dragged into." I knew he was right. Those abandoned souls, those scorched souls, all were looking for revenge for their unjust deaths. But the terrible thing was that the rage no longer distinguished between guilty and innocent. It would sweep away everything within reach. We rushed into a house that was still standing, barricading ourselves inside. But the dolls from the previous room reappeared, sitting scattered on the floor, their hollow eyes staring. One doll spoke hoarsely, "You know the truth, you must pay." I trembled, shouting, "We are not the culprits. We just want to free you." For a moment, all the dolls were silent. Then, from the mirror hanging on the wall, the shadowless guard appeared again. His face was marked with pain. His eyes were dark, but had a strange spark. He said, "I was forced to become the captor, but if you are not strong enough, you will only be the next sacrifice for this revenge." The ground shook again. A huge shadow slammed into the house. Walls shattered, windows flew open. Black hands reached in, grabbing everything. Michael and I rushed out the back door, running wildly in the whirlwind. I looked back and saw dozens of scorched children standing in a row, their eyes shining with hatred. They were no longer just asking for help, but wanted to punish. As we ran, we heard the screams of the spirits echoing behind us. No one can escape. Everyone must pay the price. I knew this was no longer a personal obsession, but a rage that would consume the entire place. The fire, the darkness, and the spirits combined into a terrible storm of revenge. The storm of darkness swallowed the village. The rocks collapsed. Screams echoed everywhere. Michael and I ran frantically, but there seemed to be no way out. The giant black shadow followed, its long arms grabbing at the air. In the midst of the chaos, the shadowless guard appeared before us again. He did not stop or attack, just looked with a choice in his eyes. "You can leave here," his voice echoed, hoarse, "but the truth will be lost forever. Or stay, expose everything, and pay with your souls." Michael and I looked at each other, our hearts pounding. We had gone too far, there was no turning back. Michael nodded slightly, and I knew we were both thinking the same thing. We had to leave the truth behind, even if it meant drowning. We raised the files, shouting into the storm. The fire was not an accident. You did not die in vain. The truth must be known. The pages glowed, emitting a white light, tearing through the darkness. The child's soul screamed, but this time it was not filled with resentment, but with relief. Each scorched figure dissolved into light. Flying into the sky, the giant black shadow howled angrily, but the light from the file grew stronger. It shrank, distorted, and exploded with a loud roar. The entire village shook one last time before collapsing completely. Michael and I collapsed, the light engulfing us. When I opened my eyes, I found myself sitting in the courtyard of Northwood School on a peaceful morning. There was no more darkness, no more fire, only sunlight shining through the broken windows. Michael lay beside me, gasping for breath, his eyes wide with surprise. The scorched file lay in the middle of the yard, now reduced to ashes. I stood up, looked around. The shadowless guard stood at the school gate. For the first time, I saw him smile. The dark eyes closed, his figure slowly dissolving into the sunlight. And then he disappeared completely, leaving behind a silent void. I knew we had made it. The souls were freed, the truth was revealed, but the haunting never left. Every night, I could still hear the wind whistling through the hallway, the sound of footsteps somewhere. Perhaps the darkness was just sleeping, waiting for someone to awaken it again.